Montana Territory, October 1878. The wind howled low across the open plains as Nolan Lattimer rode hard beneath a starless sky, his horses' hooves pounding steady against the frozen dirt. The chill in the air bit through his coat, but he leaned forward in the saddle with purpose, eyes sharp, breath fogging in front of him. He had been riding for hours, heading west from Miles City after delivering cattle to a rancher near the Tongue River. He should have stopped for the night. But something had kept him pressing forward, some itch under his skin he could not name. Then he heard it. A sound so soft it nearly disappeared under the wind, a cry strained and broken. It came again, faint but real. A woman's voice. Nolan pulled hard on the reins. His horse shuddered to a halt. He turned in the saddle, listening. Help! There it was. He dismounted fast, tying the reins to a crooked pine branch. His boots crunched over shallow snow as he moved toward the sound. The moon broke through the clouds just enough to light the edge of a gully. Below, curled against the base of a fallen tree, was a woman. Her dress was torn, her hands scraped, and her face ghost pale. She looked up at him, lips trembling. "Please, my children." He dropped to his knees beside her. "Hey now, I've got you," he said, voice low and steady. "Where are they?" Her eyes rolled back before she could answer. Nolan caught her before she collapsed fully, lifting her gently into his arms. She was light, too light, and her skin cold. He carried her back to his horse and wrapped her in his bedroll before mounting up with her cradled against his chest. They rode through the cold night, his jaw set, heart pounding not from the ride, but from the fear in her voice. "My children." He brought her to a hunting cabin he knew, half a day's ride from town. It had a stove, a cot, and enough supplies to hold them over. He laid her down, lit the fire, and tended to her wounds as best he could. When she came to, hours later, her eyes locked onto his. "You found me," she whispered. "I did," he said. "Name's Nolan Lattimer." She blinked slowly. Sierra Kersey." He poured warm water into a tin cup and helped her drink. "You said something about children. Are they out there?" She nodded, and tears rolled down her cheeks. "Mabel and Martin, they're 6 and 4. We were in a wagon, headed to Fort Benton. A man offered us a ride. I thought he was kind." Her voice broke. "He turned mean, said he'd take me and leave them. I fought him. We crashed off the trail. I got away. I tried to find help, but..." Nolan's stomach turned to stone. He stood fast, grabbing his rifle and coat. "You stay here. Lock the door behind me." "I am going with you," she said, trying to rise. "No, you cannot even stand." Sierra's hands trembled as she gripped the blanket. "Please, bring them back to me." He met her eyes. "I swear I will." Nolan left before dawn. He followed the trail east, reading the broken branches and wagon ruts. Hours passed. Then he saw the wreck, an overturned wagon. One wheel snapped clean off, the canvas torn, footprints, small ones. He followed them down a shallow ravine and found them huddled together beneath a rock outcropping, 2 children, wrapped in a frayed quilt, shivering but alive. The girl looked up first. "Are you here for Mama?" "I am," Nolan said, kneeling. "She sent me." The boy clutched his sister's arm. "She is okay. She is safe, waiting for you." He wrapped them in his coat and carried them back, one on each hip, their arms around his neck. They did not speak much, but the girl, Mabel, hummed softly under her breath as if she were trying to keep her brother calm. Nolan's chest ached. When he walked through the cabin door with the children in his arms, Sierra let out a sob that shook her whole body. "My babies," she whispered. The children ran to her, climbing into the cot. She held them both so tight Nolan thought she might never let go again. He turned to give them privacy, but her voice stopped him. "Nolan." He looked back. Tears traced down her cheeks, but her eyes were steady. "Thank you," he nodded, throat thick. "You are welcome." They kept to the cabin for 3 days while Sierra regained her strength. Nolan hunted, chopped wood, made stew. The children warmed to him quickly. Martin followed him like a shadow. Mabel asked him questions too many to answer. Sierra watched him quietly, her eyes lingering longer each day. On the 4th morning, she stepped outside where he was splitting logs. "You did not have to stay," she said. "I know." She crossed her arms, shivering a little despite the shawl. "Most men would have just left me there. He set the axe down and looked at her. Most men are not me, she smiled, tired and small but real. No. You are not. The wind picked up and she stepped closer to him without thinking. He took off his coat and draped it around her shoulders. Their hands brushed. She looked up at him, eyes searching. I thought I would die out there, she said. I thought I would never see them again. You did not, he said. You fought, you held on, her eyes welled again. Because I had to, for them, she paused. And for something I did not even know was coming. Nolan frowned slightly. What do you mean? She hesitated, then reached up and touched the edge of his collar. I did not know you were out there, but you came. I heard you cry out, he said, voice rough, and everything stopped. Sierra nodded slowly, and her fingertips stayed against his coat. I thought I had nothing left, but now. He stepped closer. You have everything. She swallowed hard, her eyes full of emotion. So do you. Nolan touched her face gently, brushing a stray hair from her cheek. She leaned into his hand. Neither of them moved for a long moment. Then he leaned down and kissed her soft, sure, warm. She kissed him back, arms slipping around his waist, her body pressing into his. When they pulled apart, she rested her forehead against his chest. I want to stay, she whispered. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her close. Then stay, he said. With me. And she did. Snow clung to the slope behind the cabin, melting in patches beneath a weak late autumn sun. Nolan stood beside the chopping block, sleeves rolled to his elbows, splitting the last of the lodgepole pine he'd hauled down from a ridge the day before. The rhythm steadied him. The axe rose and fell, wood split and fell away, but his mind wasn't on the task. Inside, Sierra was teaching Martin how to lace up his boots. Mabel sat beside them, threading pine needles onto a bit of string she'd found in Nolan's saddlebag. Every so often, Sierra's voice would drift out a soft correction, a quiet laugh. The sound struck Nolan deeper than he liked to admit. He wasn't used to voices in the morning, wasn't used to anyone waiting for him to come through a door. When he stepped inside, Sierra looked up from where she knelt, her hand resting lightly on Martin's back. She didn't smile, but her eyes softened. There's a storm moving in from the northwest, Nolan said, setting the firewood by the stove. We'll need to ride out tomorrow if we're aiming to beat it, Sierra nodded. How far is Fort Benton from here? 4 days if we keep steady. I've got enough feed and provisions to see us through. She pulled her braid over her shoulder and began untying the end. I don't want to go back there, she said, her voice low. He looked over. She didn't meet his gaze. My sister lives in Helena. I'd meant to go there eventually, just didn't have the coin for the whole fare. That's why I took the ride with that man. She paused, working her fingers through the braid. He said he'd take us part way, and I thought that was enough. You could still go to her, Nolan said. I could. She looked at him then, but I'm not sure I want to. He waited. I haven't seen her in 7 years, not since Mabel was a baby. She writes letters, asks about the children, but it's always through her husband. He doesn't think I've made good choices. You did what you had to. I did what I could, she said. Sometimes that's not enough for people. She stood and walked to the window, resting one hand on the frame. Outside, wind stirred the bare branches. When I was a girl, I thought I'd marry a man who built houses. I liked the idea of someone who could make something that lasted. My father said I was foolish, that love didn't mean anything when the roof leaked. Nolan set the kettle on the stove without speaking. Sierra turned back to him. You're quiet, I'm thinking. About what? He shrugged. About roofs and who fixes them when they leak. She crossed her arms. And I'd rather be the one who builds it right the first time. Her eyes didn't leave his. Do you think that's still possible after everything? He nodded once. If both hands are building. Mabel looked up from her pine needle string. Mama, can we stay here? Sierra hesitated. Nolan crouched beside the stove, feeding in a split log. The smell of pitch filled the air. I've got land south of here, he said. Cabin's small, but there's room to add. Soil's fair, and there's a creek that doesn't dry up after spring. It ain't much, but it's honest. Sierra knelt beside Mabel, smoothing the child's hair. You're offering us a place, I'm offering you a beginning. She said nothing for a long moment. Then she reached for the kettle, poured water into the tin cups, and handed him one. "Tell me about the land," she said. "All of it." He sat beside her on the floor, his long legs bent, the cup warm in his hands. "There's a cottonwood that turns gold in September," he said. "Big enough to shade a wagon team. Deer come down to the creek in the evenings. Hawks nest in the bluff above. You can hear them call when the wind's real still." "What about winters?" "Hard," he said. "But you learn what to stack and when. Keep the stove fed, keep the roof mended," she nodded slowly. "And the nearest neighbor, about 6 miles east. Old widow grows squash and raises goats. She'll trade eggs for flour if you bring the sack." Sierra leaned back against the wall, her shoulders relaxing. "Sounds like the kind of place a woman could grow quiet in." He looked at her. "Quiet isn't always lonely." "No," she said. "Sometimes quiet's exactly what you need." The wind picked up outside. Martin curled against Sierra's side, thumb tucked into his mouth. Mabel leaned into Nolan's arm without thinking, and he stilled, surprised by the weight of her trust. Sierra watched the two of them a long while before speaking. "If I'm going to build something again," she said, "I want to do it with someone who won't walk away when the next storm comes." He didn't look away. "I've already ridden through it." She nodded once, then reached over and rested her hand on his. "Then maybe it's time we start packing." They left just after first light, frost still clinging to the grass like sugar on pine needles. Nolan rode ahead, Sierra behind him with the children tucked beneath a thick wool blanket in the wagon seat. The old mare pulling it moved steady, hooves crunching over the frozen earth. By midday, the wind shifted and brought the scent of pine and river silt. Nolan took that as a sign they were close. The cabin sat in a draw beneath a rise of land, sheltered from the worst of the wind. It wasn't large, just a single room, a lean-to for tools, and a smokehouse further down the slope, but the roof held tight, and the front door swung true on its hinges. Nolan stopped beside the corral, let his horse cool, then turned to help Sierra down. She stepped lightly to the ground, her eyes scanning the land, the bare cottonwoods beyond the fence line, the low rise where the bluff began. Her lips parted, but she said nothing. Mabel clambered down next, tugging Martin after her, and ran toward the split rail fence with a cry of delight when she spotted a rabbit darting for cover. Nolan watched Sierra's face as she took in the details: the stacked firewood, the line of stones edging the garden bed, the water bucket still hanging from the pump. "This is yours," she said at last. He nodded, untying the bedrolls from the back of the wagon. "It's ours now if you still want it." She walked to the porch and ran her hand along the smooth edge of the railing. "It's more than I expected. I didn't build it all at once." She turned, eyes steady. "Neither did I." That night, after the children were asleep beneath quilts laid on a straw mattress near the hearth, Sierra stepped out onto the porch. Nolan was there already, seated on the top step, sharpening a blade by lantern light. She leaned against the post, arms wrapped around her middle. "I'll help plant next spring," she said. "Potatoes, maybe some carrots if the ground's soft enough." He didn't look up. "There's a spot just east of the stream where the soil's loam. Never tried carrots, but it'd be worth it. I can sow too. Not like my mother, but enough to mend what needs mending." He finished the blade and set it aside. "You don't have to prove anything to me." "I know." She hesitated, then sat beside him. The lantern threw faint light across her cheek. "I'm not used to being looked after." He leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. "I'm not looking after you. You're not something lost." Her hand brushed against his, then stayed there. "I was for a long time." He turned toward her, a quiet pause stretching between them. "You're not anymore," she nodded, eyes shining faintly in the lantern glow. "No, I'm not." The wind moved through the cottonwoods like distant waves. Nolan reached behind him, pulled the wool blanket from the porch rail, and draped it over her shoulders without a word. She looked down at their joined hands. "Do you want this?" she asked. "Not just the house or the land, me, us." His voice came low and firm. "I wouldn't have brought you here if I didn't." She drew in a breath, slow and visible in the cold air. "I want it too." He covered her hand with both of his, the calluses of his palms rough against her skin. Then it settled. She leaned into him, her head resting lightly against his shoulder. "You didn't ask what I'd name the baby if I'd had a third," he stilled. "No." "I didn't. I would have named her Clara," she said. "After my grandmother, she was the only one who ever told me I was strong." Nolan looked out at the dark slope beyond the yard. "You are," she closed her eyes. "You make me feel like I could be." They sat like that a long while, the lantern flickering low, the porch creaking beneath their weight. Two people worn by different kinds of weather but warmed now by something held quiet and sure between them. When they stood, she didn't let go of his hand. Inside, the fire had burned low, casting long shadows over the floor. Mabel stirred in her sleep, then settled. Sierra pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders and turned to Nolan. "I think we'll be all right here." He stepped close, his voice barely above a whisper. "We already are." He kissed her then, not with urgency, but with the steadiness of a man who had waited long enough and still chose patience. Her hands rested against his chest, and when she whispered his name, it wasn't in fear or desperation, this time it was in trust. At last, she rested her forehead against his. "I never believed I could belong anywhere again." "You do now," he said. "With me." And she did. By late November, the wind cut sharper and the sky hung low with the promise of snow. The fields had hardened, the creek slowed under a skin of ice, and the mornings began in silence so thick even the horses seemed to move quieter through it. Nolan rose before the light, as always, but now he wasn't alone in the dark. Sierra stirred as he pulled on his boots, her breath rising pale in the cold room. She didn't speak, just reached over the children where they lay curled near the hearth and handed him the scarf she'd finished mending the night before. "You'll need this," she said, voice husky with sleep. The winds shifted again. He took it and wrapped it around his neck without a word. Her fingers lingered at the edge of the wool, then withdrew. That day, he rode to the trapline while she stayed back with the children. Mabel had taken to shadowing Sierra through basic chores, eager to learn the names of roots and how to pinch the wick of the oil lamp just so. Martin mostly followed the dog, a mutt that had wandered in from the woods a week back and hadn't left since. They named it Calico for the blotches across its face. When Nolan returned near dusk, the scent of something baking met him before he reached the porch. He stepped inside to find Sierra bent over the Dutch oven, her sleeves rolled to the elbow and a streak of flour across her cheek. "I found a bit of cornmeal in the last sack," she said. "Figured it was time to use it before it turned." He took off his gloves and warmed his hands near the stove. "Smells like something worth coming home for." She glanced at him. "Then it's good you did." Over supper, Mabel recited the story Sierra had told them during the day, a tale about a girl who traded a silver button for a cup of honey, and how the sweetness changed her whole village. Martin insisted the dog had howled at the right part. Nolan listened with quiet amusement, watching the way Sierra's expression shifted when she looked at the children, then at him, as though she were still learning the shape of something she hadn't dared believe in. Later, once the children were asleep and Calico had curled into a tight ball beneath the stove, Sierra stepped outside to shake out a blanket. Nolan followed her, wrapping his coat tighter against the night. "Sky's clear," he said. "Means it'll freeze hard before morning." She nodded, eyes lifted. "I've never lived anywhere you could see stars like this. You'll get used to it." "I hope not." They stood in silence, the cold settling deep until she turned to him. "You're quiet tonight, just thinking." "About what?" He hesitated. "About land south of here. There's a draw with good grazing. If I went in with a neighbor, we could run more cattle come spring." She folded the blanket in her arms. "You'd need help for that." "I would. No one can tend two places at once." "No." She looked down at her hands. "You're asking if I'd stay on. I'm asking if you want this to be yours too, not just borrowed warmth until you find something better." Her voice came soft. "There isn't something better." He stepped closer, the porch creaking under his weight. "Then say it." She lifted her chin. "This is where I belong." He reached for her then, not in hunger but in certainty. She came into his arms with a breath that shuddered out of her, and he held her as the cold wrapped the night around them. "I'll marry you," she said into his chest. "If you'll have me." "I already do," he said. "But I'll ask anyway, proper." She pulled back, smiling faintly. "Then do it." He cupped her face in his hands. "Sierra Kersey, will you be my wife?" "I will." They kissed beneath the stars, the kind of kiss that doesn't need to lead somewhere because it already has. Inside, the fire burned low and steady. The wind pressed against the walls but found no way in. And for the first time in years, both of them rested without watching the door. The wedding happened on a cold December afternoon, not long after the first true snow settled over the land. They cleared a space in the cabin, moved the table against the wall, and swept the floor twice. Nolan wore the pressed shirt he'd saved from his days driving cattle out of Kansas, and Sierra sewed a new hem on her best dress, pale blue with a faded calico pattern. Mabel picked dried wildflowers from the bundle they'd hung above the hearth, tying them into a small ring with bits of thread. Martin carried it like a crown, though no one told him it wasn't meant to be worn. Mrs. Talbot, the widow Nolan had mentioned only once before, arrived in a sled drawn by a pair of mules. She brought a Bible and a tin of biscuits wrapped in linen. Her hands were worn and strong, her voice low and sure as she read the vows. Sierra's fingers didn't tremble when she took Nolan's hand. His grip was warm and steady, and when he answered, he did not raise his voice, but it filled the cabin all the same. Afterward, they shared the biscuits with honey and butter, and Sierra spooned out the last of the preserves she'd been saving. No one made a speech. No one needed to. The children curled up on the straw mattress, sticky with jam and tired from the cold, and Mrs. Talbot left before the light faded, saying only, "That's a good man you've got." Sierra didn't answer. She simply watched Nolan as he stoked the fire, the ring on her finger catching the flame's light. They fell into routine after that, but it wasn't the same. Nolan's boots still left tracks by the door, but now Sierra's shawl hung beside his coat. The cabin no longer held just the echo of chores, it carried laughter that came without warning, the kind that slipped out as they worked side by side, shaping a life neither of them had dared imagine before. One morning, while Nolan was mending fence along the southern post, Sierra walked out with a tin cup of chicory and a letter clutched in her other hand. "I had a reply," she said, handing him the folded paper. He wiped his hands and opened it. The ink had run in places, but the message was clear. Her sister in Helena welcomed the news, said she would visit once the pass thawed, and included a pressed flower from her own daughter's garden. "I wasn't sure I should write," Sierra said. "But I'm glad I did." "You've got folk who care," Nolan said. "That counts." She looked out across the rise. "It's easier now knowing what I want." Hard things don't feel as heavy when you've got something to walk toward. That spring, they fenced the pasture farther out, planting a row of willow saplings along the edge. Mabel took to the work quickly, learning to drive fence staples while Martin busied himself with the dog, who'd taken to guarding the chickens like it was born to the role. Sierra started keeping a ledger tracking the eggs, the cloth she bartered, the seeds Nolan brought back from town. She spoke less often about what she'd left behind and more about what she hoped to grow. Beans, onions, gooseberries if she could coax them. One evening, as the sky turned soft with dusk, Nolan took her hand where they sat on the porch. "I've been thinking," he said, "about building on. A second room, something proper for the children." She studied their hands, weathered and lined, resting together without needing to grasp. "We'll need more nails," she said, "and I've got a scrap of ticking that could make a fine curtain." He turned his head toward her. "You want to draw it up with me?" "I do." They kissed in the quiet, no urgency, just the steady promise of every day that had brought them to this one. The years that followed didn't come easy, but they came full. The land gave what it could, and they took only what they needed. The children grew, and so did their confidence. Sierra's hands, once hesitant, grew sure in the soil and at the ledger. Nolan, who had once ridden west with no home but a saddlebag, now walked fence lines with a purpose that never wavered. One summer evening, Mabel asked why there were no photographs of the wedding. Sierra only smiled. "Some things don't need a picture," she said. "They live in the way we wake up each morning, in the things we choose to build." Years passed. The house grew, the cottonwoods thickened, and the creek never ran dry. Nolan kept the same saddle, though he rode less. Sierra kept the same ring, though her hands changed. They still sat on the porch in the evenings, still watched the sky shift, and still reached for each other without needing to speak. And in every season, through lean years and lush ones, through births and goodbyes, through all the quiet moments that stitched a life together, Sierra and Nolan lived exactly as they'd promised. Side by side, on land they'd shaped with love and grit, held not by fate but by choice. Forever.